getting us started here. And again, a reminder that our hope is to have a time for questions from you all. So Suzanne is just right there. And if you would like to write a question for Debbie on a note card, please do that. We're going to take as many as we have time for tonight, but it might also be an opportunity for her to connect with you later at some point to follow up on your curiosity. Definitely, at least someone write a question, though.
Make sure they raise their hand.
If you would like a note card, even if you're flattering me and don't intend to write a question, just put your hand up and Suzanne will bring you a pen and a note card. So, wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much for coming out this evening. A special thank you to the host of this evening, which really isn't me. I had this grueling job of getting to read this book and then ask questions about it. Ooh, a priest's worst nightmare. But for Suzanne and Marjolin and the team here, so many of you who have made tonight, Alex and Mary, Bert, so beautiful and wonderful. Our sexton Molly, who came and set up all of these chairs, and the cocktail tables arrived at like 3 o'clock this afternoon, so we put those together, and you wouldn't have known that if I hadn't told you, but this is church, so this is how we do it. Our caterers, everything that came together, and of course, all of it so that you could be here, because what Debbie knows in her writing is that if it's just for herself, that's one thing, but if it's shared with the world, then the blessing just ripples out, and you all are part of that, so thanks for being here. So, I have talked about this interview with Debbie precisely not at all. So, she is in the same seat as you all are in this. She will know that one of my favorite interviews, and probably hers too, interviewers, is Krista Tippett, so this is about the closest I'll ever come. And in her podcast, of course, or her previous show on Being, she always starts the interview with a question. What was the religious or spiritual background of your childhood? And I would ask you that question, but this book is kind of like one big answer to that question. So I'm going to go on and ask a couple of questions, and depending upon how long those answers go, then I'd like to turn it over to some audience questions, and then I have a couple of questions before turning it over to Debbie, who's going to read some selections, excerpts, and share a little bit more. And then after that, we'll finish off the hors d'oeuvres. You can get your book signed or get a copy of the book if you need it. So how does that fall?
And cake.
Yes, that's right. The cake will be cut. The beautiful cake will be cut, and we'll enjoy that after. So I'm curious. I'd like for you to share. This is not your first book, right? This is your second book, and so you've written before to us in Messy Things. But I would like to share a little bit about your journey to this book, because it is one thing, right, to experience life and wisdom and witness, and then it's another thing to want to share that. So we, think about some of the ways we know that you've shared that, right? Give a lecture or a reflective talk at a retreat, right? To write a creative essay, something at this point you might be able to do in your sleep. Compose a sermon, which you do brilliantly. But it's also another thing to write as you have, apart from, of course, the bidding and the deadline set by publishers and editors and all of those things. So I just invite you to share a little about of your journey to writing this book for us.
Well, first of all, thank you all so much. I'm just speechless with gratitude for all of you, for this incredible community that I get to be a part of, from all different areas of my life. So I don't even know what to say. Thank you so much. That's a great question. So I've always written. I started writing as a little kid. I was lucky to have a mom who was a teacher, and so I was her little pupil from the time I was big, and I remember the day when she first gave me one of those little adorable pink covered journals with a little key, and you could feel all special because you could lock it afterwards. I'm sure she opened it and read everything anyway, but still, this idea that I could kind of process my life through writing was all the light bulbs went off. That was my way forward from that first time as a, 5-year-old maybe. And so every time I had a question, every time something was hard, every time I just didn't know how to be in the world, my response to that would be to go to the page and kind of wrestle it out on paper. I didn't write because I knew, I wrote because I didn't know. And writing was my way of figuring out things, exploring things, and learning. And with this particular book, I grew up, as many of you know, not in the Episcopal Church. I grew up conservative evangelical, a preacher's kid, steeped in church. Like, we practically, literally lived in church. And unlike many preacher's kids who kind of, the cliche is that PKs hate it, I did not hate it. I loved it. I was a little nerd, church nerd from the time I was tiny, and loved that whole world very, very, very much. But then as I got older and my own faith began to expand, I met people from very different traditions. Some of that early scaffolding began to get shaky. And I knew I didn't want to leave the faith altogether, but I knew that that particular expression was not going to work for me anymore. And at that time, I wanted things to read. Like, that was my way of figuring things out. Like, where are the books? Where are the stories of people who have stayed inside Christianity but have found other rooms, other ways of exploring faith? And I didn't find much. And Toni Morrison, who I adore, has this wonderful thing that she says, like, if there's a book that you want to read and it doesn't exist, then, well, you gotta write. So I think that was kind of the invitation, that what would I have wanted to hear? What kind of invitation would I have really hungered for as a young person, trying to stay inside Christianity, but differently? And so that's what brought me to this.
Beautiful. So just a warning, if you start thinking that you want some kind of book to exist, all of you who are out there. So we're going to open the book a little bit here, and spoiler alert, Debbie lives. She makes it through the end of the book. Bad, sorry. I'm sorry. New. Anyways. For those of you, just think about it for another minute. But actually, that is a reference to my favorite, probably my favorite line in the whole book, of encountering you in this book, which is just like an unfolding conversation with you, which I get to sometimes you're having it with me as a reader, and sometimes I'm getting to listen in on you having it, and I love that. So, but there's this point in the book, it's on page 64, you don't have to look at it because I'm not asking a question about it, but she describes some of her sensitivities in reading scripture, and she says, but what if Lazarus didn't want to be raised? Which I love that way of this, hearing this young girl wrestling with faith in different ways, and then kind of asking all of these questions that don't necessarily are the first 10 questions you might ask about something, but you've been there. So I'd like to open the book to chapter 5. If you have a book and want to look, you're welcome to it. It's sort of at the beginning of chapter 5. The page number is really 73, 74. 74 is where I'm picking up this particular line from. But you write about and not just in this portion, but about the experience of being an immigrant family, of having the language of your mother tongue, as it were, being the language of your home, and then also having this other language, English, that, wrestling with why no one spoke your language, but you were speaking, and learning English and such. So you have this moment when you encounter Sarah, you do that in the family system, right, in the context where she has been sort of let into that space, I think one of your uncles, and you say this, or Sarah says this, I think. She said, I didn't know how many things were unsayable in a single language. So what Sarah does is she comes in, she has met one of your uncles, and she recites just almost poetically a verse in, is it Malayalam? Malayalam. See, I couldn't even say the thing that she said. So she recites this, and she starts to tell about a story, and she says, I didn't know how many things were unsayable when you're limited to a single language. And you write that she had interrupted the single story, and then in doing so, she had rendered us less strange. So later in that chapter, you write a little bit about how Pentecost surprised people in the fact of their understanding, not in the message that they were hearing, right? It was a familiar message, but the surprise was the fact of their understanding. So communication for me is something that seems really difficult, like even in one language, it seems, even in, you limit it to a dialect. So what I wanted to ask you about, or just have you talk a little bit about, was this idea that the experience of being understood is something that is so precious and important, especially if you feel understood in the language of your own being, heart, etc. And you write about when someone has experienced that it's hard for them to, like my words now, disinherit you. Yeah. And so I wonder if you could just speak about maybe from that chapter or other times where in your travels and other ways you've sort of had that invitation to communication where real communication, real sharing of meaning has happened, and perhaps an invitation out of that for us.
Wow, that's a huge question.
Right, you just said two.
So I think one of the challenges of growing up an immigrant kid is this constant sense of not quite belonging. You're always kind of hovering over to at least two worlds. And especially when you're a second generation, on top of that, there's the job of having to translate in some sense for your parents. Because children, we're young, we pick up the new language quickly, we're moving in that world, into the adopted world more fully, but our parents are still, they're nostalgic about the home country, they're still trying to hold on to those roots, and so it becomes a child's job to do the translation. And sometimes that's very hard and painful to have to do that. And being a kid and being self-conscious, you then also begin to feel shame, like, why can't my parents just be more American? Why are they embarrassing me by being so Indian? Oh my goodness, and all the kind of self-consciousness of that. And that played into my faith life too, because if you read the book, you'll see that I also had a very compartmentalized spiritual life. We went to American church on Sunday mornings, and then we went to Indian church on Sunday afternoons, and they were very separate. How I encountered God was separate, how the language was separate, the way of worshiping was separate. So I felt very divided up. And there was a loneliness in that. And so I think because of that, I have a real soft heart for people who struggle in that way and feel the loneliness of not quite belonging because of culture or language or being stuck in between two places. And so I can't say enough about how important it is to try as much as possible to lean into other people's languages, literal or metaphorical. There's so many ways in which we don't speak the same languages. We see the world differently because of the way we were raised, the language in which we first encountered God. And to try to meet people in that place, not with a sense of arrogance, not with a sense of I'm the host and I have something to always show you, but to sit at someone else's feet who don't speak the same language as you, especially if they've been disempowered culturally, and to say, there's so much that I can learn from the languages that you hold. How can I learn from you? How can I find the kind of fluency with you? That's really precious to me, and I'm still learning how to do it. To be honest, even 12 years in, I still feel like the language of the Episcopal Church is in many ways new to me, and I feel clumsy with it still, to be perfectly honest. And so I feel like a newcomer is still sitting at the feet of this language, trying to learn it. But I'm always excited when some people come to me and say, well, tell me about yours, and then we can begin to dialogue in that way.
All right, so I'm gonna go to another question that I have, but while I'm doing that, Suzanne, if I could have you collect note cards. If anyone has one, please, someone have one. Otherwise, the mic is only this long, so you'll have to come up here if you want to ask a question. So I do see some questions, that's fantastic. So some may know that you are in formation, specifically in formation for the priesthood and seminary, and following a calling of God to be a priest in this church. Thank you so much. This is sort of going toward the end of the book, but I'm wondering what it is that you are feeling called to wrestle with for the sake of the gospel in this church, in the Episcopal Church.
This is practice. One thing. Wow. Get harder. You'll be good for the hum.
And I think there's this moment in the treatment you have of Jacob. This is again toward the very end of the book, where Jacob has been wrestling, and Jacob's very persistent on asking God for a blessing, but also God kind of does this thing back and say, before I'll bless you, I need your name. You have to tell me your name, right? And so how do you think the church should answer what its name is to God as it asks for the blessing to continue?
I don't have my degree yet. I'm just a first-year student.
Yeah, you'll be able to answer it when you get your degree.
Isn't that an application question?
So to answer the first part of the question, or at least try to approach it a little bit, can you repeat that first part again? Sorry.
Yeah, so for me, the first part of the question is sort of what are you, particularly in view of being called to priesthood in the Episcopal Church, kind of feeling in this season called to wrestle with?
Okay. So I think because of the way I grew up, I still have a kind of evangelical, post-evangelical lens through which I see this new adopted church home. And what I often see here is that, and by here I mean the capital E Episcopal Church, is this struggle to not just keep saying who we're not, because there's a lot of pressure in our culture to keep saying we're not. We are not the fundamentalistic church. We are not the homophobic church. We are not the sexist church. And that's all so important. That is work that we absolutely must do. But I sometimes think that there's a reluctance then to step fully into what we are and to affirm that and to stand in that with a kind of conviction, because we're so afraid of sounding strident. We're so afraid of sounding like those other people who force their opinions on, all that. And so I think the church now is being called to hold our generous, capacious, roomy, invitational, inclusive faith with conviction, to stand in that, to not apologize for it, to offer it to the world from a place of strength and confidence rather than apology. So I think that would be my answer right now. Oh my goodness, as for the name of my child, wow. I think ready. We hear a lot of talk right now, and I hear it among seminary students, among priests, that the church is dying and everything's bad. And I think my response to that is this is our wheelhouse. Crucifixion and resurrection is what we do. It is what Christians have been doing for 2,000 years. So our call is to be ready for whatever that next resurrection is going to look like. It might not look the way we want it to. It might make us super uncomfortable. Oh well, that's always how it's been, right? But I think to be ready for that, whatever that next thing is, and to step into it with confidence.
Yeah. So wrestling can be kind of uncomfortable.
Just a little.
Yeah. All right. My goodness. I'm glad I learned cursive. It doesn't mean I can read it, but I will do my best. This is a good question. So, what is your writing process? And talk a little bit about that, and what is the editing process like?
Sure. So I'm a morning person. That's kind of where my best energy is. So I try, in an ideal world, I get up really early in the morning when the house is still very quiet and try to do my writing then. I have learned through hard experience that if you, quote unquote, wait for the muse, you will never write anything. It's just, you put your butt in the chair, you tell yourself your butt is not going to leave the chair until a certain amount of time has passed or a certain number of words have been written, and it could be garbage, that's fine, but you just have to produce the words, and then you get to get up. So that's the best case scenario, but of course there are times when, oh my God, there's a deadline and I have to write something, and it's frenzy and frantic, and that happens too. But ideally, it's just the discipline of sitting down and making something happen, giving yourself as much permission as possible for it to be really, really bad at first. That's just, you get it out, and then you can always go back and work on it. For me, editing is often reading all my work aloud, because what it looks like on the page, how it lives on the page is very different from how it is vocalized. So either to read it aloud myself or to have someone read it back to me, I can hear things, rhythms and clunky spots that I can't see on the page. So a lot of my editing is actually oral.
All right, so this is a two-parter here. What new rooms do you long for us to create in the church?
Good one.
What new rooms do you long for us to create in the church?
I'd love to see the Episcopal Church becoming more diverse in every iteration of that word. More young people, more people of color, people from other traditions who might be exploring or thinking of leaving the church, but for whom the Episcopal Church is a big secret. That there is a way that you can be Christian that is still expansive and generous and makes room for them in their particularity. There's space for that and welcome in that. So the more we can throw our doors open, the more we can put aside the kind of privilege, again, that says, I will always be the host because I have something to give you, but instead that much more humble posture of, I have so much to learn from you, like please come and show me. I think that would be the invitation.
And this is in conversation a little bit with the first question. When you get discouraged in your writing, how do you keep going or start again?
First, I like binge watch TV. And I eat ice cream. I read, actually. Reading helps me a lot. I'll pull something from my shelf that has deeply inspired me, whether it's a memoir or poetry or fiction, and I just remember that first, like that deep love for words and for language, and wait for that to just feed me and nourish me. And after I've spent some time in the presence of someone else's beautiful language, that kind of helps me to come back around to try it again.
All right, this is the cursive you have for me to be able to read. Debbie, what are your current thoughts about the challenges of striving to be, as inclusive as Jesus would wish, while responding to maybe changing moral expectations? I don't know that this makes sense now. Jesus asks of us. There's such a history of demands from churches that are more cultural than the commandments. And yet, God doesn't, not getting that word, but essentially doesn't also just is like loosey-goosey whatever in expectations either. So I'm going to give you the card and then have you answer that.
Sure. I think this is what I was trying to say in response to an earlier question, Nick, that you asked. That I think, again, Episcopalians, we need to not be afraid to sort of move deeper into our own convictions. And that part of that is formational. To not just say, well, the priest knew the Bible, so I don't need to know it. Or, I was confirmed, I've been baptized, so I don't really need to engage in sort of spiritual, theological deepening. Because we are in a moment when, so much is up for grabs. And I think as people of faith, we need to be able to articulate what we believe and why we believe it and why it's so important for us. To not be afraid of that. That is not just the work of the priesthood. It's not just the work of seminary professors. That is for all of us. That is for the priesthood of believers. So whatever that looks like, in your context, if it's Bible study, if it's just having conversations with people about your faith and where you're at and what you might read next, what you might talk about next, so that we can feel confident and not constantly sort of scared and apologetic about the faith that we hold, because it is beautiful. It is beautiful and the world needs it, and the longer we are too scared to speak it, the more we all suffer. So I think, I'm minister for formation, so like formation, that is the thing. Yeah, let's do formation, lots of it.
Amen.
Amen indeed. All right, so just a couple more questions, and then we're going to turn it over to Debbie to read some excerpts from her book. So, what is a question, because there could certainly be many, but what is a question that you want people like asking on the edge of their tongue, having read your book? Like what's a question you want to live in folks that they might either think about during the book or live with beyond the book?
I think for me, this book is built around this metaphor that Jesus used of, in my Father's house are many rooms, and that has become a really important metaphor for me to think about faith. But scripture and tradition are full of metaphors, so I would love for people to think about kind of their life metaphor, and it will change over the seasons. It might not always be the same metaphor, but like, what is your sort of image? What is your spiritual image that God has given to you and that God is inviting you into? It might be that you are, walking on a particular path. It might be that you are the seed going into the earth that needs to die and then come back to life to feed many other people. The Bible's full of these beautiful, beautiful metaphors. So I would invite you to consider what yours is right now and to see what it would mean to live into it.
And this last one is not a question so much as just a thank you, and then an invitation to share anything sort of in response. So chapter 6, each of the chapters have these different titles, and chapter 6's title is Getting Saved, sin. So she's talking a little bit about sin, and particularly talking about the experience of growing up in the tradition, and I think this is the chapter where you talk about how many times you experienced salvation because you thought
I was a
you
professional.
losing it and getting it, and all of these things, right? And it's a beautiful chapter because I resonate with it in my ways of coming to this book. But what I think I pick up is right at the very end, you have this almost note to yourself that for me is just so beautiful. It's on page 103 if you want to look at it. But she is talking about sort of holding on to or claiming or staying with the S words, sin and salvation. And then at the end of this chapter, having talked about her childhood and such, she said, there are still days when I grieve for the little girl I used to be. The little girl who spent so much time on her knees, chasing an elusive salvation. How many years did she spend on that cramped stage, acting out her hopeless drama with God? If I could, I'd gather her into my arms and tell her what I believe now. Salvation is so much roomier than she knows. God's favorite human emotion isn't shame. The concrete wall she's pressing against is not of God's making, and the hands she's skinning bare against it are already covered in her Savior's. She can turn away from the wall now. A God who loves her is waiting. And for me, it's like this is the gift that you may be giving to that little girl, but are also giving to us. And I hope that this book finds its way to those proverbial little girls, or to whomever find themselves in those places. Because for me, this is like a love letter to yourself in that way, and I hope one whose cup overflows. So, thank you.
Thank you all again so much for the questions and for being here. I'm just looking around the room and seeing, oh my goodness, just the gift of all of you. So thank you. So I'm just going to read two excerpts. One
As you
from
do that, I'm going to just light a candle, because I know part of what you're going to read is also a prayer.
Yes. So I'll read a section from closer to the beginning of the book and then the prayer that ends the book. And so one of the kind of arcs you'll notice as you read is this arc of kind of leaving home and then finding home. And so closer to the beginning of the book, I write about Jesus' experience of going back to Nazareth after his kind of established in his ministry and finding that homecoming very, very hard because nobody understands. His people back at home don't get him. And there's a real alienation and loneliness to that encounter that he has back in his hometown. So I'll read a little section from that. The creatures of the earth, Jesus tells an eager scribe in the Gospel of Matthew, have homes that tether them to their surroundings, homes that shelter them, homes that define their boundaries. But Jesus has nothing of the sort. No bed, no table, no room, no roof, no shelter, no haven. No place in the world to call his own. Every time I read these words, I feel a too familiar sadness. The sadness of not belonging. The grief of my grandparents who stayed behind in India to preserve a Nala that was destined to change no matter what. The sadness of my parents who bore the psychological and cultural brunt of leaving. My own sadness at finding myself betwixt and between. In the years since I left evangelicalism, this sadness has been a constant companion. My grief sits right alongside the fear that I am a traitor, a culturally disloyal daughter to the long and storied religious heritage that formed me. No matter where I go, I wrestle with a sense of betrayal. Isn't it ungrateful to walk away? Isn't it selfish? Isn't it arrogant? It is all too easy to allow this grief to dominate my faith. If I'm not attentive and careful, I can give myself over to a permanent sense of too muchness, as in, I'm too Indian, too American, too feminine, too feminist, too pious, too skeptical, too earnest, too jaded to be in a Christian community at all. I wonder if Jesus feels this way when his visit to Nazareth falls apart. Perhaps he worries that he's betraying his family by choosing a spiritual path they don't understand. The next time he interacts with his mother, maybe they talk about the shame he's caused her among their neighbors, and her embarrassment grieves him. Surely there are moments when he wishes that his path could be less costly, less treacherous. Whenever the cost of my own leaving feels acute, it helps me to think of Jesus as bicultural, belonging at once in heaven and on earth, in Nazareth and outside of it. In choosing to draw near to us, he straddles a tremendous both and he lives into that dissonance with love, patience, curiosity, and long-suffering. And the prayer at the end, so this last section of the book actually was written first. Some years ago when my family was going through a hard time, health issues and such, I was really wrestling with my faith and trying to figure out, what am I doing? Why am I still in this thing? What are the reasons to stay? And that's a question that I think all of us should ask. We should never stop asking that question. Why am I in this? Why am I in the faith? What are the things that tether me specifically into this tradition? And so I wrote a prayer called Why I Stay. And so I just want to close by reading that. Why I Stay. Because A was for Adam, B for Bethlehem, and C for cross, and my first classroom was a pew. Because I played hide and seek in the font when the preacher wasn't looking, answered every altar call with a sprint down the aisle, and snuck the leftover communion juice from the glasses the church ladies washed on Mondays. I was hoping, I see this now, to steal another drop of you. Because decades later I am still felled by stained glass, by musty old Bibles and patient sanctuaries, by altar cloths, choir robes, and candle wax. Because my breathing slows in your house, my muscles unclench and I remember how to sing loud and clear. Because you are my rootedness, my air, my water, the dark and frozen ground in which I wait to crack open, die, and blossom. You are the closest I will ever come to flourishing. Because I love stories, and I cherish the ones in your book. Because I'm Eve, and the apple makes sense. I'm Sarah, and my barrenness hurts. I'm Rachel, and I won't surrender my sacred objects. I'm Leah, and I long to be loved. I'm Hagar, and I need to name you in the desert. I'm Miriam, and I am ever watchful. I'm Mary with the jar who weeps at your feet. I'm the Magdalene, and I bear witness at tombs. I am Junia, and my story aches to be told. Because childhood ends, but childhood hungers do not. Because my first house, first father, first mother, first love, first hate, first heartbreak, first safety, first terror was you. Because the psalmist got it right. I was cast on you from birth. Because Peter got it even better. Lord, if I leave, to whom will I go? Because sorrow has come too many times, and there had better be an afterword to explain it. Because I have stood at gravesides and raged. Because my children have suffered and you have watched. Because bodies failed, minds cracked, hearts broken, we didn't live happily ever after like the fairy tales promised. Because on earth as it is in heaven is all I've got, and if it's not enough, then I am lost. Because death, where is thy sting, feels like a mockery, but Jesus wept does not. Because joy comes too, though it doesn't look anything like it should. Because sometimes, too rarely, but I'll take what I can get, the veil parts, the ground gives way, the skies open, and my hunger for you breaks into the purest communion. The hunger I carry becomes you, incarnate and shining. Because I know you in the liturgy, in the word, in the broken bread and spilled wine. I know you in the ancient redwood trees, the winding mountain trails, the shifting edges of the ocean. I hear you in the stillness of the forest, the cacophony of birdsong. I feel you in the gentle embrace of the people I love, their hands, your hands, their eyes, your eyes, their voices, soft echoes of yours. Because in those moments, the possibility of you grows and grows until I am unhoused and undone, too alive for this world. Because you are my everlasting almost. Almost here, almost certain, almost always, almost irrefutable. You are the tenuous edge I will live and die on. Because the almost of you, heartbreaking as it is sweeter than any guarantee I will find in this world. Because you are not who I thought you were, so I must wait for revelation. Because I need someone to wrestle and you meet me at the river. Because this is no ordinary hunger and your manna alone will suffice. Because I will drown unless you part this water. Because the world is dark, but it shimmers at its edges. Because I'm wild inside and you are not a tame lion. Because you suffered, and only a suffering God can help. Because my ache for you is the beating heart of my aliveness. Because I am still your stubborn child, and I insist on resurrection.